Maria Shen woke up every morning at 6:30, just like she had for the past 12 years. The alarm clock next to her bed was old and made a rattling sound, but it did the job. She would slip out of bed quietly, trying not to wake her husband, David, who worked late hours at his accounting firm. The wooden floor was cold under her bare feet as she made her way to the small kitchen of their modest, two-bedroom house. Their home wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. The walls needed a fresh coat of paint, and the kitchen cabinets had seen better days, but Maria had learned to find beauty in simple things. She would put the kettle on for tea and start preparing David's lunch for work. 2 slices of bread, some leftover chicken from dinner, an apple, and a small thermos of coffee. Always the same routine, always the same care put into every detail. After David left for work with a quick kiss on her forehead, Maria would begin her day. First, she would tidy up the house, which never took long since they didn't have much clutter. Then came the grocery shopping. She knew every store owner in their neighborhood by name. Mrs. Park at the vegetable stand always saved the best tomatoes for her, Mr. Johnson. At the corner store would ask about David's work and share stories about his grandchildren. Maria loved these small conversations. They made her feel connected to the world, even though her life was quite simple. She would walk through the neighborhood streets, carrying her cloth shopping bag, observing the changing seasons through the trees and gardens. In spring, she would stop to admire the cherry blossoms. In autumn, she would collect colorful leaves to press in old books, but there was something most people didn't know about Maria. Hidden away in the bottom drawer of her bedroom dresser, wrapped carefully in an old silk scarf, was a collection of sheet music. The pages were yellowed with age, and some had small tears at the edges. These weren't just any pieces of music. They were classical compositions, some of them quite advanced, all written in her grandmother's careful handwriting. Maria's grandmother Lily had been an extraordinary woman. Back in China, before the family moved to America, Lily had studied at a prestigious music conservatory. She had dreams of becoming a concert pianist, performing in grand halls for audiences who would hang on every note. But life had other plans. War came, then immigration, then the struggle of starting over in a new country. Lily never got to pursue her musical dreams, but she never lost her love for the piano. When Maria was a little girl, she would spend hours at her grandmother's small, upright piano. Lily would guide her tiny fingers across the keys, teaching her scales and simple melodies. Maria remembered the smell of her grandmother's lavender perfume and the way her eyes would light up when Maria played a piece correctly. Those piano lessons weren't just about music. They were about discipline, beauty, and finding something precious in everyday life. Lily would tell Maria stories while they practiced. Stories about famous composers who overcame great difficulties. Stories about music that could heal broken hearts and bring people together. She would say that music was like a secret language that could speak directly to people's souls. Maria believed every word. As Maria grew older, her talent became more obvious. By the time she was 15, she could play pieces that impressed even her high school music teacher. Her fingers moved across the keys with natural grace, and she had an unusual ability to feel the emotion behind every note. Her grandmother would sit in the corner of the room, tears of pride in her eyes, knowing that Maria had inherited not just her musical ability, but her deep understanding of what music could mean. There were dreams back then. Dreams of music school, of performances, of a life filled with beautiful sounds and appreciative audiences. Maria's high school music teacher, Mr. Peterson, encouraged her to audition for music colleges. He said she had rare talent that shouldn't be wasted. For a brief moment, it seemed like those dreams might come true, but then reality set in. Music school was expensive, more expensive than Maria's family could afford. Her parents worked hard just to pay for basic needs. Her father drove a delivery truck, and her mother cleaned offices at night. They were proud of Maria's talent, but they were also practical people. They suggested she study something more reliable, something that would guarantee a steady income. Maria understood. She enrolled in community college for business administration, telling herself that music would always be there as a hobby. But as the months passed, school became more demanding. Then she met David at a friend's birthday party. He was kind, stable, and talked about building a simple, comfortable life together. When he proposed after 2 years of dating, Maria said yes without hesitation. The decision to sell her piano came 3 years after their wedding. David had been laid off from his previous job, and money was extremely tight. They needed to pay rent, buy groceries, and somehow make ends meet. The piano, sitting in their tiny living room, suddenly seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. Maria found a buyer through a newspaper ad. A young family with a daughter who wanted to learn. The day the piano was picked up, Maria felt like she was saying goodbye to a part of herself. She stood in the empty space where it used to be, running. Her hand over the indentations the legs had left in the carpet. That night she carefully packed away all her sheet music, including her grandmother's precious compositions. She told herself it was just temporary, that someday she would have another piano, but someday never came. Life settled into its comfortable routine. David found a new job. They painted the living room, bought a small dining table to fill the space where the piano had been. Maria learned to cook new recipes, started a small garden in their backyard, and found contentment in the rhythm of domestic life. Still, sometimes late at night, when David was asleep and the house was quiet, Maria would take out those old sheet music books. She would sit on the edge of their bed, running her fingers over the notes, hearing the melodies in her mind. Her fingers would move slightly as if she were playing invisible keys. The muscle memory was still there, waiting patiently after all these years. She never told David about these late-night moments with her music. She didn't think he would understand. David was a practical man who dealt with numbers and spreadsheets. He knew she used to play piano, but he had never heard her perform. To him, it was just something from her past, like a childhood hobby that people naturally outgrow. Maria had convinced herself that she was happy with her simple life. She found joy in small things, the way morning sunlight came through their kitchen window, the satisfaction of a perfectly prepared meal, the peaceful feeling of working in her garden. She told herself that not everyone was meant for grand dreams, and that there was honor in living a quiet, devoted life. But deep inside, in a place she rarely allowed herself to visit, the music was still alive. It lived in the space between her heartbeats, in the rhythm of her daily tasks, in the way she hummed softly while cooking dinner. The music was patient, waiting for the right moment to emerge again, though Maria had no idea that moment was coming soon. It was a Tuesday evening when everything changed. Maria was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup and humming quietly to herself, when she heard David's car pull into the driveway. She could tell by the sound of his footsteps that he was excited about something. His usual tired shuffle was replaced by quick, energetic steps. David burst through the front door with a smile wider than she had seen in months. In his hand, he held a colorful brochure that he waved like a winning lottery ticket. Maria wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him curiously. David was not usually the type to get excited about much beyond a good deal at the grocery store, or his favorite team winning a game. "Maria, you won't believe what I found today," he said, practically bouncing on his feet. He spread the brochure out on their small dining table. The cover showed an elegant building with tall white columns and perfectly manicured gardens. In fancy golden letters it read Whitmore Music Institute, Community Enrichment Program. Maria felt her heart skip a beat just seeing the word music, but she tried to keep her expression neutral. David continued talking rapidly, pointing at different sections of the brochure. "Look at this, honey. They're offering piano lessons to adults in the community. It says here that they want to bring classical music to everyone, not just wealthy people." The Whitmore Music Institute was famous throughout the city. It was the kind of place where rich families sent their children to learn from world-class musicians. The building itself was like a palace, with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Maria had driven past it many times, but never imagined she would have any reason to go inside. "David, I don't think this is for people like us," Maria said softly. Looking at the pictures of elegantly dressed students and their expensive instruments, "Look at these people. They probably spend more on their clothes than we make in a month." But David was determined. He had been feeling guilty lately about how hard Maria worked to take care of their home and how little excitement she had in her life. He had noticed that she sometimes seemed distant, lost in thought, though she never complained. When his coworker mentioned seeing the community program advertisement in the newspaper, David immediately thought of his wife. "The program is specifically designed for regular people," he insisted, reading directly from the brochure. "It says they want to share the joy of classical music with the entire community, regardless of background or experience. And look, Maria, the price isn't that bad. We can afford this." Maria looked at the registration fee and felt a wave of panic. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was money they usually saved for emergencies or home repairs. She couldn't understand why David would want to spend their savings on something like this. "But David, what if I'm not good enough? What if I embarrass myself? I haven't played piano in years." David sat down next to her and took her hands in his. His palms were rough from years of working with papers and calculators, but his touch was gentle. "Maria, I've been married to you for 12 years, and I know there are parts of you that I've never really seen. Sometimes when you think I'm not paying attention, I hear you humming these beautiful melodies. And the way your fingers move when you're listening to classical music on the radio, it's like you're playing an invisible piano." Maria was surprised that David had noticed these things. She thought she had been careful to keep her musical longings hidden. She felt exposed, like David had discovered a secret diary she had been keeping. "I just think," David continued, "that maybe it's time for you to do something for yourself. Not for me, not for the house, not for anyone else. Just for you." He paused and looked directly into her eyes. "When was the last time you did something that made you truly happy?" The question hit Maria harder than she expected. She couldn't remember the last time she had done anything purely for her own joy. Her days were filled with tasks and responsibilities, all of which she performed with care and dedication, but none of which truly excited her. The closest she came to pure happiness was during those late-night moments with her grandmother's sheet music, but even those were tinged with sadness for what might have been. David pulled out his checkbook before Maria could protest further. "I'm going to sign you up," he said, already filling out the registration form that came with the brochure. "The classes start next Monday. If you hate it after the first week, we'll get our money back." Maria watched in a mixture of terror and excitement as David wrote out her information. When he got to the section asking about previous musical experience, he looked at her questioningly. "What should I put here?" "Just write some childhood lessons," Maria said quietly. She didn't want to mention how advanced she had once been. It seemed too much like bragging, and besides, she wasn't sure if any of those skills remained after so many years away from the piano. That night, Maria could barely sleep. She kept thinking about the Whitmore Music Institute and what it would be like to sit at a piano again. Would her fingers remember what to do? Would the other students be much younger and more talented? Would the teachers be patient with someone like her, or would they quickly realize she didn't belong in such a prestigious place? She got up quietly and retrieved her box of sheet music from the bedroom dresser. Sitting on the edge of the bed with the papers spread around her, she tried to read through some of the simpler pieces. The notes looked familiar, like old friends she hadn't seen in years, but she wasn't sure if she could still make sense of them. The weekend passed slowly. Maria found herself doing nervous things like reorganizing closets and deep cleaning the refrigerator. David noticed her anxiety and tried to be encouraging, but he had never seen this side of his wife before. Usually Maria was calm and steady, the one who handled stress with quiet grace. Now she seemed jumpy and distracted. Sunday evening, Maria stood in front of her closet trying to decide what to wear to her first class. Nothing seemed right. Her clothes were practical and comfortable, perfect for grocery shopping and housework, but not very impressive for a fancy music institute. She finally settled on a simple navy blue dress that she usually wore to church and her one pair of dress shoes. David drove her to the institute Monday morning since Maria was too nervous to trust herself behind the wheel. As they pulled up to the building, Maria felt overwhelmed by its grandeur. The entrance was lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, and expensive cars were parked in the circular driveway. Through the large windows, she could see students walking around with instrument cases that probably cost more than Maria's monthly grocery budget. "Are you sure about this, David?" Maria asked, gripping her small purse tightly. "Maybe we should just go home and pretend this never happened." David turned off the engine and looked at his wife with more seriousness than usual. "Maria, I love you exactly as you are. Our life together is good, and I'm grateful for everything you do. But I've always had this feeling that there's more to you than even you realize. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think this could be important." Maria took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The autumn air was crisp, and leaves were falling from the oak trees that lined the pathway to the main entrance. As she walked toward the building, she felt like she was approaching a door to a world she had left behind long ago, a world where music mattered and dreams were possible. She had no idea that some of the people inside that beautiful building were already preparing to test her in ways she couldn't imagine. The moment Maria stepped through the grand entrance of the Whitmore Music Institute, she knew she had made a terrible mistake. The lobby was more like a museum than a school, with polished marble floors that reflected the light from an enormous crystal chandelier hanging overhead. Oil paintings of famous composers lined the walls, their stern faces seeming to judge everyone who walked beneath them. Other students were already gathering near a mahogany reception desk, and Maria could immediately tell she didn't fit in. The women wore designer clothes and carried expensive handbags. Their jewelry caught the light as they moved, and they spoke in confident voices about their previous musical training and their children's achievements at various prestigious schools. The men looked like successful businessmen or retired professionals, the kind of people who belonged in country clubs and attended charity galas. Maria clutched her simple black purse closer to her body and tried to make herself invisible. She had thought her navy dress was appropriate, but next to these people, she felt like she was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. Her shoes, which had seemed fine at home, now squeaked slightly on the marble floor, making her cringe with each step. A tall woman with perfectly styled silver hair approached the group. She wore a flowing black dress that probably cost more than Maria's monthly household budget, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of privilege. This was Professor Hamilton, the head of the community program, though she looked like she belonged in a palace rather than teaching regular people. "Welcome to the Whitmore Music Institute," Professor Hamilton said, her voice carrying the kind of refined accent that suggested expensive education and high social standing. "I trust you all understand what an honor it is to be here. This institute has trained some of the world's finest musicians, and we maintain the highest standards even in our community outreach efforts." As Professor Hamilton spoke, her eyes scanned the group, clearly evaluating each person. When her gaze fell on Maria, it lingered for a moment longer than the others. Maria saw something flicker across the professor's face, a look that seemed to say, "What is she doing here?" The group was led through a series of practice rooms, each one more impressive than the last. The walls were lined with expensive wood paneling, and every room contained a beautiful grand piano that gleamed under soft lighting. Professor Hamilton explained that each student would be assigned to work with different faculty members based on their skill level and goals. During the tour, Maria tried to stay near the back of the group, hoping to avoid drawing attention to herself, but her efforts backfired when Professor Hamilton suddenly stopped and turned around, focusing directly on her. "You there?" Professor Hamilton said, pointing at Maria with a perfectly manicured finger. "What's your name, and what's your musical background?" Maria felt her cheeks burn as everyone turned to look at her. "I'm Maria Chun," she said quietly, her voice barely audible in the large room. "I had some piano lessons when I was young, but I haven't played in many years." Professor Hamilton raised one eyebrow and exchanged a quick glance with another instructor who had joined the tour. "I see," she said, drawing out the words in a way that made Maria feel even smaller. "And what made you think you were ready for an institute of this caliber?" The question was asked in a tone that seemed friendly on the surface, but Maria could hear the underlying criticism. She felt trapped with all eyes on her, and she stumbled over her words. My husband thought it would be good for me to try something new. I didn't really expect to be here either. Some of the other students exchanged looks, and Maria caught a few suppressed smiles. She realized that her honesty had made her seem even more out of place. In this world, people were supposed to project confidence and ambition, not admit that they felt uncertain about their abilities. Professor Hamilton nodded slowly, as if Maria had confirmed exactly what she had suspected. Well, we certainly appreciate enthusiasm, even when it's not accompanied by preparation. The comment drew a few quiet chuckles from the other students, and Maria wanted to disappear through the floor after the tour. The students were divided into smaller groups for individual assessments. Maria found herself in a practice room with Professor Hamilton and 2 other faculty members. The room was intimidating, with its high ceiling and formal furniture arranged around a magnificent black grand piano. Please sit down and play something. For us, Professor Hamilton said, settling into a leather chair with a clipboard in her lap. Anything that demonstrates your current ability level. Maria approached the piano bench with shaking hands. The instrument was more beautiful than any piano she had ever seen, with keys that felt perfectly balanced under her fingers. For a moment, she was transported back to her childhood. Remembering the joy of making music with her grandmother, she decided to play a simple piece by Bach that she remembered well, something that wouldn't be too challenging but would show that she had some musical foundation. As she began to play, something magical happened. Her nervousness faded away, and her fingers found their way across the keys with surprising confidence. The melody filled the room, and for those few minutes, Maria forgot about everything except the music. When she finished, the room was silent. Maria looked up hopefully, thinking perhaps she had done better than expected, but the expressions on the faculty members' faces were not what she had hoped to see. Professor Hamilton was writing notes on her clipboard, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. That was adequate, Professor Hamilton said finally, for someone who clearly hasn't maintained their skills. Your technique is rusty, your interpretation lacks sophistication, and your posture needs significant work. She paused, then looked directly at Maria with what seemed like a calculating expression. However, I think we can help you reach your potential. Maria felt confused by the mixed message. The criticism stung, but the professor seemed willing to work with her. She nodded eagerly, grateful for any chance to prove herself. Professor Hamilton stood up and walked to a cabinet filled with sheet music. She pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the piano. We believe in challenging our students from the very beginning, she said, opening the folder to reveal pages of incredibly complex musical notation. This is Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It's one of the most demanding pieces in the classical piano repertoire. Maria's heart sank as she looked at the sheet music. The pages were covered with notes that seemed to dance and swirl in patterns that made her head spin. She could see immediately that this was far beyond anything she had ever attempted, even in her most confident days as a teenager. Professor Hamilton, Maria said carefully, I don't think I'm ready for something this difficult. Maybe we could start with something simpler and work up to pieces like this? The professor's smile was not warm or encouraging. Nonsense, she said firmly. True musicians rise to meet challenges. Besides, this will be perfect for our end-of-semester showcase. All community program participants will perform for the entire Institute family, including our board of directors and major donors. Maria felt the blood drain from her face. A public performance was terrifying enough, but attempting to play a piece this difficult in front of an audience of music experts seemed like a recipe for complete humiliation. But what if I can't learn it in time? What if I embarrass myself? And the Institute? Professor Hamilton exchanged another look with her colleagues, and Maria caught the hint of a smirk on the woman's face. Well, that would certainly be unfortunate, the professor said. But we have faith that with enough practice and dedication, even someone with your limited background ... can make progress. The way she said limited background made it clear that Professor Hamilton didn't actually believe Maria could succeed. In fact, Maria was beginning to realize that this assignment wasn't meant to help her grow as a musician. It was meant to put her in her place, to show her and everyone else that she didn't belong in this refined world of classical music. As Maria left the institute that day, clutching the impossible sheet music, she felt smaller than she had in years. The other students had received much more reasonable assignments, pieces that challenged them without setting them up for failure. Only Maria had been given something that seemed designed to prove that some people simply weren't cut out for serious music. Walking to the parking lot where David was waiting for her, Maria fought back tears of frustration and embarrassment. She had been so nervous about not being good enough, and now it seemed like her worst fears were coming true. The professors had seen right through her, recognizing immediately that she was just a simple housewife who had wandered into a world where she didn't belong, but deep inside, beneath the humiliation and fear, something else was stirring. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, a spark of the determination that had once driven her to master difficult pieces under her grandmother's patient guidance. Professor Hamilton might have intended to crush Maria's spirit, but she had also awakened something that had been sleeping for far too long. That evening, Maria sat at her kitchen table staring at the sheet music spread before her like an impossible puzzle. The pages of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 seemed to mock her with their complexity. Black notes crowded together in patterns that looked more like abstract art than music. She had been sitting there for over an hour, and David had already asked twice if she was coming to bed. "Just a few more minutes," she called back, though she knew she wasn't making any real progress. Every time she tried to follow a single line of melody, it would twist and turn into something even more complicated. Her eyes felt strained from squinting at the tiny symbols, and her head was beginning to ache. David appeared in the doorway wearing his old pajamas, his hair messy from lying down. "Maria, you've been staring at those papers all evening. What's wrong?" Maria looked up at her husband, and for the first time since she'd gotten home, she felt the urge to cry. "They gave me something impossible, David. Look at this." She turned the pages toward him, pointing at the dense clusters of notes. "This isn't music for beginners. This is what concert pianists spend months learning." David moved closer and looked at the sheet music, though he couldn't read a single note. To him, it just looked like a lot of black dots on white paper. But he could see the despair in his wife's eyes, and that was enough to make him understand. The situation was serious. "Maybe you should ask for something easier," he suggested gently. "There's no shame in telling them you need to start with simpler pieces." Maria shook her head. "I already tried that. Professor Hamilton made it very clear that this is what I'm supposed to play, and that real musicians don't back down from challenges." She paused, remembering the condescending tone in the professor's voice. "I think they want me to fail, David. I think they gave me this piece because they know I can't do it." The realization hung in the air between them. David felt angry on his wife's behalf, but he also felt guilty. He was the one who had pushed her to join this program. He was the one who had insisted she needed something exciting in her life. Now it seemed like he had set her up for humiliation. "We can get our money back," David said quietly. "You don't have to put yourself through this." Maria looked down at the sheet music again. Part of her wanted to take David's suggestion and walk away from the whole situation. It would be easier to return to her comfortable routine of grocery shopping and housework than to face the possibility of failing in front of a room full of sophisticated people. But then she thought about her grandmother Lily, who had given up her own musical dreams and never got the chance to pursue them again. She thought about all those late nights when she had imagined playing beautiful music for people who would really listen. Most of all, she thought about the look on Professor Hamilton's face, that smug certainty that Maria wasn't good enough to belong in their world. Something shifted inside Maria, a spark of stubbornness that she hadn't felt in years. "No," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "I'm not going to quit. They think I can't do this, but maybe they're wrong. Maybe I'm stronger than they think." David looked at his wife with surprise. He rarely heard such determination in her voice. But Maria, if the piece is really too hard, then I'll make it less hard, Maria said, standing up from the table with new energy. I'll figure out a way. I have to at least try. The next morning, after David left for work, Maria wrapped the sheet music in a kitchen towel and put it in her purse. She had remembered something from her childhood visits to the public library. In the basement, next to the old reference books that nobody used anymore, there was a small room with an ancient upright piano. It had been donated years ago by someone's estate, and the library kept it for community events that rarely happened. Maria hadn't been to the library in months, but when she walked through the familiar doors, she felt a sense of comfort. The librarian, Mrs. Rodriguez, recognized her immediately. She was a kind woman in her 60s who had worked at the library for over 20 years and knew most of the regular patrons by name. "Maria, how nice to see you," Mrs. Rodriguez said with a warm smile. "Are you looking for anything special today?" Maria felt nervous about her request, but she forced herself to ask. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I was wondering about the piano downstairs. Would it be possible for me to use it sometimes? I'm working on learning a piece, and I don't have a piano at home." Mrs. Rodriguez's face lit up with interest. "Of course, nobody ever uses that old thing. It's probably out of tune, but it still works. You're welcome to practice down there whenever you like, as long as you're not too loud during busy hours." The basement was cool and quiet, filled with old books and forgotten furniture. In the corner, under a dusty sheet, was the piano Maria remembered. It was nothing like the beautiful grand piano at the Institute, but when she lifted the cover and pressed a key, it made a sound that filled her with hope. The piano was indeed out of tune, and some of the keys stuck slightly, but it was real. Maria could sit at the bench, spread out her sheet music, and actually try to play the notes instead of just staring at them on paper for the first week. Maria's practice sessions were frustrating disasters. She would arrive at the library each morning, carrying her sheet music and a small notebook to write down problems she needed to work on. But every time she tried to play even a small section of the ballade, her fingers would stumble and the music would fall apart. The piece was like trying to juggle while riding a bicycle for someone who had never done either activity. Chopin had written music that required both hands to play completely different patterns at the same time, with tempo changes and dynamic shifts that demanded years of advanced training to execute properly. But Maria was determined not to give up. She remembered her grandmother's teaching methods and began breaking the piece down into tiny sections. Instead of trying to play entire pages, she would focus on just 4 or 5 measures at a time. She would play the right-hand part slowly until she had it memorized, then do the same with the left hand, then try to put them together at a snail's pace. Each day she made tiny amounts of progress. A section that had seemed impossible on Monday might be playable by Friday, though still far from perfect. Maria started carrying a small recorder that David had given her years ago for making grocery lists. She would record herself playing small sections, then listen to the playback at home to identify problems she needed to fix. Mrs. Rodriguez often heard the piano sounds coming from the basement and would sometimes venture down to listen. She was amazed by Maria's dedication and the gradual improvement she could hear week by week. "You're working so hard," she would say. "What's the piece you're learning?" When Maria explained about the Institute and the impossible assignment, Mrs. Rodriguez became indignant on her behalf. "That doesn't sound fair at all. It sounds like they're trying to make you fail." "Maybe," Maria said, taking a short break from practice, "but every day I can play a little bit more of it. My grandmother always told me that music has its own kind of magic. If you're patient enough and work hard enough, the magic starts to happen." As the weeks passed, something unexpected began to occur. Maria's muscle memory from her teenage years started to return. Her fingers began to remember how to stretch for difficult intervals, how to navigate complex passages, how to make one hand independent from the other. Skills that had been buried for over a decade slowly surfaced, like plants growing toward sunlight. More importantly, Maria began to understand the emotional story that Chopin had written into the music. The ballade wasn't just a series of difficult technical challenges. It was a journey through different moods and feelings, from gentle melancholy to passionate intensity to moments of pure joy. As Maria learned to play the notes, she also learned to feel what the music was trying to say. David noticed changes in his wife that went beyond her daily trips to the library. She seemed more focused and energetic. She would come home from practice sessions with calluses forming on her fingertips and a look of quiet satisfaction on her face. Sometimes he would catch her tapping out rhythms on the kitchen counter while cooking dinner, her fingers moving in patterns he didn't recognize but that seemed to have their own logic. "How's the piano practice going?" he would ask, and Maria would smile in a way that reminded him of when they were first dating, and she would get excited about small things. "It's hard," she would say, "but it's good hard. Like when you're building something and you can see it getting better piece by piece." One evening, about 6 weeks into her secret practice routine, Maria was working on a particularly challenging section when she realized something remarkable had happened. She was playing music that 3 months ago she would have thought was completely beyond her abilities. Her hands were moving across the keys with confidence, and the sounds coming from the old piano actually resembled the beautiful piece Chopin had intended. She wasn't ready for the showcase yet, and there were still many difficult passages that needed work, but for the first time since Professor Hamilton had handed her that intimidating sheet music, Maria believed that success might actually be possible. The woman who had wanted to make her fail had underestimated the power of quiet. Determination and the patient magic of music learned one note at a time. 2 months into her secret practice sessions, something extraordinary began happening to Maria. It started on a rainy Thursday morning when she was working on a particularly emotional section of the ballade. She had played through the passage dozens of times, focusing on getting the technical aspects right, when suddenly the music seemed to take on a life of its own. Instead of just pressing keys in the correct order, Maria found herself telling a story through the music. The gentle opening melody reminded her of quiet conversations with her grandmother, full of wisdom and warmth. The more dramatic middle sections spoke of struggles and challenges, like the times when life had seemed too difficult to handle. And the triumphant passages felt like moments of pure joy, like the day she had married David or the first time she had successfully grown tomatoes in her little garden. Mrs. Rodriguez was shelving books upstairs when she heard something different coming from the basement. The sound that drifted up through the old building wasn't just someone practicing scales or struggling through difficult passages. This was real music, the kind that made people stop whatever they were doing and listen. She quietly made her way downstairs and stood outside the practice room, not wanting to interrupt but unable to walk away. What she heard made her eyes fill with tears. The old, out-of-tune piano was singing in a way she had never heard before. Maria's playing had transformed from careful technical exercises into something that touched the soul. When Maria finished the section, she sat quietly for a moment, surprised by what had just happened. For the first time in months, she hadn't been thinking about finger positions or tempo markings. She had simply been feeling the music and letting it flow through her. "That was beautiful," came a soft voice from the doorway. Maria turned to see Mrs. Rodriguez wiping her eyes with a tissue. "I'm sorry for listening without permission, but I couldn't help myself. That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years." Maria felt embarrassed but also proud. "Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez. I think I'm finally starting to understand this piece, not just learn it." Over the following weeks, Mrs. Rodriguez made a habit of finding excuses to be near the basement during Maria's practice times. She would bring down books to be stored or check on the heating system, but really she just wanted to hear the music. Sometimes she would bring her lunch downstairs and eat quietly while Maria played, feeling like she was attending a private concert. "You know," Mrs. Rodriguez said one day during one of Maria's breaks, "my late husband used to say that there are 2 kinds of musicians. There are the ones who can play all the right notes, and there are the ones who can make you feel something. You're the second kind." Maria was touched by the compliment, but she still felt uncertain about her abilities. "I don't know if I'm really a musician at all. I'm just a housewife who's trying not to embarrass herself at a fancy music school. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head firmly. Maria, I've been listening to you play for weeks now. I've heard you struggle and improve and find your voice. What you're doing isn't just playing notes correctly. You're creating something beautiful that didn't exist before you sat down at that piano. As Maria's technical skills improved, she began to add her own interpretations to Chopin's composition. She would slow down certain passages that spoke to her emotionally or emphasize phrases that reminded her of specific memories. The piece began to reflect not just Chopin's original vision, but Maria's own life experiences and feelings. The dramatic crescendos reminded her of moments when she had to be strong, like when David was unemployed and she had to stretch their grocery budget to feed them for a month. The gentle, melancholy sections spoke of quiet loneliness, the kind she sometimes felt when David was working late and the house seemed too empty. The triumphant finale felt like all the small victories that made life worth living, like the satisfaction of a perfectly cooked meal or the joy of seeing flowers bloom in her garden. One afternoon, Mrs. Rodriguez brought a surprise visitor to the basement. Her daughter Carmen, who taught music at the local high school, had been curious about the mysterious pianist her mother kept talking about. Carmen had studied piano for years and had even performed with the City Symphony on a few occasions. Mom has been raving about your playing, Carmen said as she settled into a chair near the piano. Would you mind if I listened to a bit of what you've been working on? Maria felt nervous about performing for a real music teacher, but she had grown more confident over the past few weeks. She decided to play the section she knew best, a beautiful melodic passage that had become like an old friend to her. As Maria played, Carmen's expression changed from polite interest to genuine amazement. When the music ended, Carmen sat in silence for a moment before speaking. Maria, that was incredible. The way you shaped those phrases, the emotion you put into every note. Have you been studying with a private teacher? No, Maria replied, feeling both proud and confused. I've just been practicing here by myself, trying to figure it out as I go along. Carmen shook her head in disbelief. What you just played showed an understanding of musical interpretation that usually takes years of advanced study to develop. You're not just playing the notes that Chopin wrote. You're communicating with the audience, telling them a story. Maria had never thought about her playing in those terms, but Carmen's words helped her understand what had been happening during her practice sessions. She wasn't just learning a difficult piece of music. She was discovering her own voice as a musician. There's something special about the way you approach this music, Carmen continued. It's honest and genuine in a way that you don't often hear, even from technically perfect performers. You're not trying to impress anyone or show off your skills. You're just sharing something beautiful. That evening, Maria came home from practice with a different energy than usual. David noticed immediately that she seemed lighter, more confident. During dinner, she talked about her day at the library with an enthusiasm he hadn't heard in years. Mrs. Rodriguez brought her daughter to listen to me play today, Maria said, cutting her chicken into small pieces. She's a real music teacher, and she said I have something special. David smiled, happy to see his wife so animated. That's wonderful, Maria. I'm proud of you for sticking with it, especially after that rough start at the Institute. You know, what's strange? Maria said, pausing with her fork halfway to her mouth. I don't think about the Institute anymore when I'm practicing. I don't think about Professor Hamilton or whether I'm good enough for their standards. I just think about the music and what it means to me. This was exactly the transformation that David had hoped for when he first signed Maria up for the program. He had wanted her to find something that belonged to her alone, something that would remind her of who she was beyond her roles as wife and caretaker. As the weeks passed, Maria's playing continued to evolve. She began to understand that her lack of formal training, which Professor Hamilton had seen as a weakness, was actually a kind of strength. She wasn't bound by academic rules about how the piece should be interpreted. Instead, she was free to discover her own relationship with the music. The calluses on her fingertips had thickened, and her hands had regained the flexibility and strength they had possessed in her youth. More importantly, her confidence had grown. When she sat at the old piano in the library basement, she no longer felt like an imposter trying to fake her way through something too difficult. She felt like a musician with something important to say. Mrs. Rodriguez had started bringing friends and family members to hear Maria play. Word was spreading quietly through the community about the remarkable woman who practiced at the library every day. People would make excuses to visit the library during Maria's practice times, hoping to catch a few minutes of her beautiful music. "You should be performing for bigger audiences," Mrs. Rodriguez said one day after Maria had finished practicing. "This music shouldn't be hidden away in a basement." "People need to hear what you can do," Maria smiled but shook her head. "I'm not ready for that. I'm still just learning. Besides, I have my performance at the Institute coming up. That's enough of an audience for me." But privately, Maria was beginning to realize that something fundamental had changed. The scared, uncertain woman who had first sat at this piano was disappearing. In her place was someone who understood that she had a gift worth sharing, and the courage to believe in herself was growing stronger every day. The night before the showcase, Maria couldn't eat dinner. She pushed the food around on her plate while David watched her with growing concern. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she kept glancing at the sheet music that sat on the kitchen counter like an old friend she was about to say goodbye to. "Maria, you've been practicing for months," David said gently, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "You know this piece better than you know our address? Why are you so nervous?" "Now?" Maria set down her fork and looked at her husband. "Because tomorrow isn't about whether I can play the notes correctly. Tomorrow's about proving that I belong in that world, and I'm not sure I do." For weeks, Maria had been confident during her practice sessions at the library. In the quiet basement with Mrs. Rodriguez listening supportively, she felt like a real musician. But now, thinking about walking onto a stage in front of professors, donors, and sophisticated audience members, all her old insecurities came flooding back. "What if I forget everything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if my hands freeze up? What if they all realize that Professor Hamilton was right about me from the beginning?" David pushed back his chair and walked around to his wife's side of the table. He knelt down beside her chair and took both of her hands in his. "Maria, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really listen to me." She looked into his eyes, seeing a seriousness there that surprised her. "3 weeks ago, I went to the library during my lunch break," David continued. "Mrs. Rodriguez told me which room you practice in, and I stood outside the door and listened." Maria felt a jolt of surprise. "You heard me playing? Why didn't you tell me?" David's eyes grew soft, and Maria could see emotion building there. "Because I was crying too hard to talk to anyone. Maria, I had no idea. In 12 years of marriage, I never knew that you could create something so beautiful." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I stood in that hallway listening to you play, and I realized that I had been living with someone extraordinary without even knowing it. The music you were making wasn't just technically good. It was the kind of music that changes people." Maria felt tears forming in her own eyes. "David, you don't understand music. You're just being kind." "No," David said firmly. "I don't understand the technical parts of music, but I understand how it makes me feel. And what I heard that day made me feel like I was listening to something sacred, like you were sharing a part of your soul with the world." He stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, picking up a small wrapped package that Maria hadn't noticed before. "I bought you something," he said, returning to the table. "I was going to wait until after the performance, but I think you need to see it now." Maria unwrapped the package with trembling fingers. Inside was a small, elegant silver bracelet with a tiny piano charm hanging from it. Engraved on the back of the charm were the words to Maria, "You were always a musician. Love, David." "When did you get this?" Maria asked, touching the delicate charm. "The day after I heard you play at the library. I went to 3 different jewelry stores trying to find something that would remind you of who you really are." David fastened the bracelet around Maria's wrist. "You're not a housewife who happens to play piano. You're a musician who happens to also take care of a home." That evening, David suggested they take a walk through their neighborhood. It was a warm spring night, and many of their neighbors were outside tending their gardens or sitting on their porches. As they walked, David pointed out things he had never mentioned before. "See Mrs. Park's vegetable garden?" he said, gesturing to their neighbors' perfectly organized rows of plants. "Everyone on the block asks her for advice because she has a gift for growing things." And Mr. Johnson's woodworking shop? People drive from across town to buy his handmade furniture because he creates something special? Maria listened, not sure where David was going with this observation. "My point is," David continued, "that talent shows up in all kinds of places. Mrs. Park didn't go to fancy gardening school, and Mr. Johnson learned woodworking from his father in a garage. But both of them have something real and valuable to offer the world." He stopped walking and turned to face his wife. "Tomorrow you're going to walk into that fancy building, and some people might look at your simple dress or your nervous smile and think they know who you are. But when you sit down at that piano, you're going to show them something they've probably never seen before." "What's that?" Maria asked. "Pure, honest music. Not music that's trying to impress anyone or follow all the rules perfectly. Music that comes from someone who has lived a real life and has something genuine to say." When they returned home, Maria felt calmer than she had all day. She decided to play through the ballade one final time, using the small keyboard that David had surprised her with the week before. It wasn't anything like the grand pianos at the Institute, but it was theirs, and it sat in their living room where the old dining table used to be. As her fingers moved through the familiar passages, Maria realized that the piece had become a part of her in a way she hadn't expected. The music wasn't something external that she was trying to conquer. It was something that lived inside her now, connected to her memories and emotions and experiences. The opening theme reminded her of the quiet mornings in her kitchen, making coffee and watching the sun rise through the window. The dramatic middle section spoke of all the challenges she had faced and overcome, from losing her first piano to rebuilding her confidence note by note. The triumphant ending felt like a celebration of the journey itself, not just the destination. "That was beautiful," David said when she finished. He was sitting in his favorite armchair, and Maria realized he had been listening with the same attention he usually reserved for important news or his favorite television shows. "Thank you for believing in me," Maria said, closing the keyboard cover gently, "even when I didn't believe in myself." David smiled. "Maria, tomorrow you're going to walk into that showcase, and you're going to remind everyone in that room why they fell in love with music in the first place, including yourself." That night, Maria laid out her clothes for the next day. She had chosen the same navy dress she had worn to her first class at the Institute, but somehow it looked different now. Where she had once seen something plain and inadequate, she now saw something honest and appropriate. She wasn't trying to pretend to be someone else. She was Maria Chun, a woman who had worked hard to learn something beautiful, and that was enough. Before going to bed, she opened the drawer where she kept her grandmother's old sheet music. The pages were still yellowed and fragile, but now they looked like treasures rather than artifacts of a lost dream. She touched the handwritten notes in the margins, where her grandmother had made small corrections and suggestions decades ago. "Tomorrow, Grandma," Maria whispered to the quiet room, "tomorrow I'm going to play our music for people who will really listen." As she drifted off to sleep, Maria could almost feel her grandmother's gentle presence, the same comforting feeling she had experienced during those childhood piano lessons. In her dreams, she was sitting at a beautiful piano, playing for an audience that understood not just the technical difficulty of what she was attempting, but the courage it had taken to attempt it at all. The alarm clock would ring in just a few hours, but for now, Maria slept peacefully, her new bracelet catching the moonlight from the bedroom window, the tiny piano charm glinting like a promise of something wonderful about to begin. The morning of the showcase arrived with bright sunshine streaming through the kitchen window. Maria woke up surprisingly calm, as if all her nervousness had been washed away during the night. She made her usual morning tea and sat quietly at the kitchen table, Watching the steam rise from her cup and thinking about how much her life had changed over the past few months, David was unusually quiet during breakfast, but Maria could tell he was excited for her. He kept glancing at her with a proud smile, like a parent watching their child prepare for a big school presentation. "What time shall we leave?" he asked, checking his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. "The showcase starts at 2 o'clock. But I need to be there by 1:30 for a quick rehearsal," Maria replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Are you sure you want to come? It might be boring for you." David looked at her like she had asked the most ridiculous question in the world. "Maria, I wouldn't miss this for anything. I've been waiting months to hear you play that piece all the way through." By noon, the Whitmore Music Institute was buzzing with activity. Elegant cars filled the parking lot as board members, major donors, and faculty families arrived for the community showcase. The main concert hall, which was usually reserved for the most prestigious events, had been decorated with fresh flowers and programs printed on expensive paper. Maria and David arrived at 1:15, and Maria felt a familiar flutter of intimidation as they walked through the marble lobby. The other community program participants were already there, most of them looking confident and well-dressed. Maria noticed that several of them were chatting easily with faculty members, as if they had become friends over the course of the program. Professor Hamilton appeared wearing an elegant black suit and her usual expression of cool authority. She gathered the performers for a brief meeting in one of the practice rooms. "Today is your opportunity to demonstrate what you've learned during your time with us," she announced, looking at each student in turn. "Remember that you are representing not just yourselves, but the reputation of this institute." When her gaze fell on Maria, Professor Hamilton's expression didn't change, but Maria caught something in her eyes that looked almost like curiosity. Over the past few months, Maria had attended her required weekly lessons, but she had been careful not to reveal how much progress she was actually making. She would play sections of the ballade adequately enough to avoid criticism, but never with the full emotion and skill she had developed during her private practice sessions. "Mrs. Chun," Professor Hamilton said, "I trust you're prepared to give your best effort today, regardless of the outcome." The comment was clearly meant to lower expectations, to suggest that Maria's best effort would still fall short of the Institute's standards. But Maria simply nodded politely and said, "I'll do my best, Professor Hamilton." The rehearsal was brief, just enough time for each performer to familiarize themselves with the concert grand piano on stage. When Maria's turn came, she played only the opening section of the ballade, enough to check the piano's touch and sound. She kept her playing deliberately restrained, saving her full interpretation for the actual performance, but even her restrained playing caught the attention of the other students. One woman leaned over to her friend and whispered, "That sounded much better than I expected." Maria pretended not to hear, but she felt a small surge of confidence. By 2 o'clock, the concert hall was filled with an impressive audience. Maria peeked through the side curtain and saw rows of well-dressed people chatting quietly while they waited for the program to begin. David was sitting in the third row, looking slightly out of place in his best suit but beaming with pride. The showcase began with a flute performance, followed by a violin duet. Each piece was politely received with appropriate applause. Maria watched from the wings as student after student performed competently but without anything that could be called true inspiration. The audience seemed engaged but not particularly moved by what they were hearing. Maria was scheduled to perform fourth, right after a cello piece that was technically perfect but emotionally flat. As the cellist took his bow to polite applause, Maria felt her heart begin to race for the first time all day. This was it. Everything she had worked for over the past few months was about to be tested in front of the most sophisticated musical audience she had ever encountered. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said, "our next performer is Maria Chun, who will be playing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor." Maria heard her name and felt her legs somehow carry her onto the stage. The concert hall seemed enormous from this perspective, with hundreds of faces looking up at her expectantly. The stage lights were bright and warm, and the beautiful black concert grand piano waited for her like an old friend. As she walked across the stage in her simple navy dress, Maria could hear whispers from the audience. She knew they were probably wondering who this plainly dressed woman was and why she had been given such a challenging piece to perform. She caught sight of Professor Hamilton sitting in the front row, her expression unreadable but her posture suggesting she was prepared for disappointment. Maria sat down at the piano bench and adjusted her position carefully. She looked out at the audience for just a moment, and her eyes found David's encouraging face in the third row. He gave her a small nod, and she could almost hear him saying, "Show them who you really are." She placed her hands on the keys and took a deep breath. In that moment, everything else faded away. The fancy concert hall, the intimidating audience, the months of doubt and struggle, all of it disappeared. There was only Maria, the piano, and Chopin's beautiful music waiting to be shared. The opening notes of the ballade floated into the concert hall like a gentle conversation. Maria's touch was light and expressive, each note carefully shaped and given its own meaning. The melody spoke of quiet reflection and hidden depths, like looking into still water and seeing more than you expected. As the piece developed, Maria felt herself becoming completely absorbed in the music. This wasn't the scared housewife who had stumbled through her first lesson months ago. This was a musician who had something important to say, and the confidence to say it beautifully. The audience began to sense that something special was happening. Conversations stopped, programs were lowered, and people leaned forward in their seats. Even Professor Hamilton's composed expression began to change, her eyebrows raising slightly as she realized that the woman she had tried to humiliate was playing with genuine artistry. Maria navigated the technical challenges of the piece with surprising grace, but more importantly, she infused every passage with emotional truth. The dramatic middle section spoke of struggle and determination, reflecting her own journey from doubt to confidence. Her fingers flew across the keys with power and precision, but never at the expense of musical meaning. When she reached the triumphant finale, Maria felt like she was sharing not just Chopin's vision, but her own story of perseverance and discovery. The final chords rang out in the silent concert hall with such authority and beauty that for a moment, no one seemed to breathe. The silence lasted for 3 full seconds, which felt like an eternity to Maria sitting at the piano. Then the concert hall erupted in applause unlike anything the community showcase had ever heard. People weren't just clapping politely out of obligation. They were standing, cheering, and some were wiping tears from their eyes. David was on his feet immediately, applauding so enthusiastically that other audience members turned to look at him with smiles. Professor Hamilton remained seated, but Maria could see her clapping with genuine respect. Her usual condescending expression replaced by something that looked almost like amazement. As Maria stood to take her bow, she felt a profound sense of completion. She had proven to herself and everyone else that she was exactly who she had always been deep inside, a musician with something beautiful to offer the world. The scared, uncertain woman who had first walked into this building months ago was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and wasn't afraid to share her gifts. The applause seemed to go on forever. Maria stood beside the piano, overwhelmed by the response from the audience. She had expected polite clapping, maybe even some disappointed faces, but this was something entirely different. People were on their feet, some wiping their eyes, others shaking their heads in amazement. The sound filled the concert hall like thunder, and Maria felt like she was standing in the middle of a beautiful storm. As the applause finally began to die down, Maria walked off the stage on shaking legs. Her hands were trembling from the adrenaline, and she felt like she might cry from the sheer emotion of what had just happened. She had done it. After months of doubt and secret practice, she had not only survived the performance but had actually moved people with her music. Backstage, the other community program participants looked at her with a mixture of respect and confusion. They had been politely supportive during their weekly classes, but none of them had expected Maria to deliver a performance like this. One woman approached her with genuine admiration. Maria, that was absolutely incredible. Where have you been? Hiding that talent? Before Maria could answer, Professor Hamilton appeared in the backstage area. The professor's usual composed expression had been replaced by something Maria had never seen before, genuine surprise, mixed with what looked like grudging respect. She approached Maria slowly as if she was seeing her for the first time. "Mrs. Chung," Professor Hamilton said, her voice quieter than usual, "I need to speak with you privately." They walked to a small practice room away from the other students. Professor Hamilton closed the door and turned to face Maria. For a long moment, the two women just looked at each other, the memory of their first meeting hanging in the air between them. "I owe you an apology," Professor Hamilton said finally. "When I assigned you that piece, I thought I was teaching you a lesson about knowing your place. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Maria felt a surge of vindication, but also something unexpected. Sympathy for the professor, who had clearly been shaken by what she had witnessed. "Professor Hamilton, I understand why you made the assumptions you did. I probably would have made the same ones." The professor shook her head. "No, what I did was unprofessional and unkind. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment." She paused, looking genuinely troubled. "What you did out there wasn't just technically impressive. It was artistically mature in a way that most of my advanced students never achieve." "Thank you," Maria said simply. Not sure what else to say, Professor Hamilton straightened up, regaining some of her usual authority. "I'd like to offer you a position as a guest instructor here at the Institute. We could use someone with your natural musical instincts to help teach our younger students about emotional expression in classical music." The offer hung in the air between them. A few months ago, Maria would have been overwhelmed by such an opportunity, would have seen it as validation that she finally belonged in this sophisticated world. But now, standing in this practice room, she realized that she no longer needed the Institute's approval to feel worthy. "I'm flattered by your offer, Professor Hamilton," Maria said carefully. "But I don't think teaching here would be the right fit for me." The professor looked surprised. "May I ask why not?" Maria thought about her answer for a moment. "Because the most important part of my musical journey happened in a basement practice room at the public library, with an out-of-tune piano and a kind librarian who believed in me. That's the kind of environment where I want to share music with others." Professor Hamilton nodded slowly, and Maria could see a new understanding in her eyes. "I think I see what you mean. You're looking for authenticity rather than prestige." "Exactly," Maria said. "Thank you for everything you've taught me, even the difficult lessons." When Maria returned to the main area, she found David waiting for her with the biggest smile she had ever seen on his face. He swept her into a hug that lifted her off the ground. Not caring who was watching or whether it was appropriate behavior for such a formal venue. "Maria, I am so proud of you I could burst," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Do you have any idea what you just did in there?" Before Maria could answer, they were approached by several audience members who had been waiting to speak with her. A woman with silver hair and elegant jewelry introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson, a major donor to the Institute. "My dear, that was the most moving performance I've heard in this hall in 20 years, Mrs. Patterson said, taking Maria's hands in hers. "You have a gift that shouldn't be hidden away. Have you considered giving concerts?" Behind Mrs. Patterson, a small crowd had formed of people wanting to congratulate Maria or ask her questions. She saw the music journalist who covered classical performances for the city newspaper, several faculty members who looked at her with new respect, and even some of the Institute's advanced students who had heard about the performance and wanted to meet her. But the person Maria was most happy to see was Mrs. Rodriguez, who had somehow made her way backstage with tears streaming down her face. The kind librarian pushed through the small crowd and embraced Maria warmly. "I knew this day would come," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered in Maria's ear. "I knew that basement practice room was just the beginning." Over the next hour, Maria found herself having conversations she never could have imagined. The music journalist wanted to write a feature story about her journey. Several parents asked if she would consider giving piano lessons to their children. A local concert series director mentioned that they were always looking for interesting performers who could connect with audiences. Through it all, Maria felt a strange sense of calm. The attention was flattering, but it didn't define her worth the way she once thought it would. She had already proven to herself what mattered most, that she was a musician with something valuable to share. As the evening wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Maria and David finally had a moment. Alone, they walked slowly through the Institute's elegant hallways, past the oil paintings of famous composers and the display cases full of awards and honors. "So what happens now?" David asked, taking her hand as they walked. Maria smiled, fingering the small piano charm on her bracelet. "Now I go home and start teaching piano lessons in our living room." Mrs. Rodriguez already has 3 families who want to sign up their children. "In our living room?" David asked, sounding delighted by the idea, "if that's okay with you. I want to teach music the way my grandmother taught me, with patience and love and the understanding that everyone has their own musical voice waiting to be discovered." David stopped walking and turned to face his wife. "Maria, a few months ago, you were convinced that you were just a simple housewife with no special talents. Look at you now." Maria thought about his words as they continued toward the exit. "I think I was always this person, David. I just forgot for a while." 2 weeks later, Maria's living room had been transformed into a small music studio. David had surprised her by having their old dining table refinished and moved to make room for the beautiful upright piano he had been secretly saving money to buy. The walls were decorated with some of her grandmother's old sheet music, now properly framed, and a comfortable chair sat in the corner for parents who wanted to listen to their children's lessons. Maria's first student was an 8-year-old girl named Lucy, whose mother had heard about Maria's performance from Mrs. Rodriguez. As Lucy placed her small fingers on the keys for the first time, Maria felt the same sense of wonder she had experienced during her own childhood lessons with her grandmother. "Music is like a secret language," Maria told Lucy, echoing the words her grandmother had spoken to her decades earlier. "Once you learn to speak it, you can share feelings and stories that regular words can't express." In the evenings, after her students had gone home, Maria would often play the ballade that had changed her life. But now she also played other pieces, some that she was learning and some that she composed herself. Simple melodies that captured the joy of ordinary moments and the beauty of dreams that come true when you're patient enough to nurture them. The scared woman who had first walked into the Whitmore Music Institute was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true success wasn't about impressing elite audiences or gaining prestigious positions. It was about finding your authentic voice and having the courage to share it with the world, one beautiful note at a time.